When I was a teenager, there was one show I really loved seeing. One show that you might judge me for, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it anyway. There's this show, TV show, where every single time I see it, there was like this shock factor that would like grip my attention, but also make me nauseous at the same time. Have you ever watched one of those shows? This show that I'm talking about is Fear Factor. By the way, it's back, for those of you who are interested. But I'm not recommending this show. I'm just saying I saw it, okay? I'm admitting it. In this show, you'll see tanks full of scorpions, snakes, and spiders. You're gonna see people eating animal parts that were not meant for human consumption. You're gonna see people jumping off high, like tall, burning buildings. People crammed into the tightest spaces with a straitjacket. Whatever your phobia is, they got something just for you, right? Customized just for you. And so as you're watching this, the point of this is that these factors, these things are meant to make you afraid in such a way where it's meant to test your tolerance for fear until you tap out, until you're like, I have had enough. I can't do this. Because on the other side of your fear is cash. They got a prize, right? But you would watch this show and, you would judge them for being crazy. And then once you find out how much money is the prize, then you're like, would I do it? First you're like, why would they do it? Then you're like, would I do it? And then you're like, or would I just tap out? And I'd be like, no, I'm done, right? My threshold, it's over. Fear factor. But sometimes, it's funny, it's fun whenever you can watch it on a show and you're like, okay, I can just turn it off and I'm done, I'm out. But have you ever had a season in your life which felt like an episode of Fear Factor, but it's a reality show for you, right? Have you ever been in a crisis, a moment in your life where you were afraid? Where that thing that you were dreading, that thing that you felt like your life was just falling apart because the nightmare of your dreams was now your reality. Maybe you have gone through a financial crisis in your life. All your savings are spent. Maybe it's the one health diagnosis you were hoping and praying and fasting that the doctor would say, hey, this thing that we found is not a cancer, but it is. Maybe it's a broken marriage that's spiraling. Maybe you've lost your job and you don't know how to tell your family. What are you afraid of? What is that one fear in your life that grips you where if that happens, everything falls apart? And in that, where is God in all of it? Where's faith in all of it? The question we want to address today is, what do you do when your fears make you want to tap out on your faith? What do you do when your fears make you want to tap out on your faith? And we're going to actually work through the end of Mark 4 and the beginning of Mark 5 to explore this. For those of you who are like, Dave, we're in John. That's next week. We'll go back to John next week. But I really wanted to, just accountability's sake, all right? But today, I really wanted to explore this topic of fear because I believe we are living in very fearful times. Most of us, a lot of us today, are operating out of fear. So in Mark 4 and 5, we're really going to see this in our time together. We're going to see one greater story split up in two parts that's really telling us one key message for our time today. Are you guys with me? One story, two parts, one key message. Let's go. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. I'm going to start reading for us. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side, and leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? The author Mark tells us that earlier in the chapter, Jesus has been on a preaching ministry, preaching from a boat to a large crowd on the beach. That sounds amazing, by the way. And after a full day of preaching, then he took a boat, and now they are at sea late at night, by the way. I don't know how many of you guys would be like, I feel safe at sea late at night in a small boat. But there's Jesus, right, and the disciples. And that their worst nightmare for any sailor happened, right? For any fisher. A great windstorm, not just a little windstorm, a great storm happens. Can you visualize this storm? The winds were wreaking havoc. The waves were crashing into the boat, and their little small fishing boat was about to capsize. It was getting filled up. Even Jesus' disciples, some of whom were actually professional fishermen, were like, yeah, we're going to die. There's no way. They were in full-blown panic. But what was Jesus doing this entire time? Sleeping. He was taking a nap. He was in full REM, deep sleep, whatever you want to do. Like, he doesn't need any help. Right? He's not a light sleeper. He was all out sleeping. He was out cold after a full day of preaching. I understand that. But waves splashing on your face, the wind, the people screaming, you're just still knocked out. That was Jesus, right? So with Jesus sleeping, what do the disciples choose to do? Jesus, just a little, we didn't read it today, but Jesus had told them, we're going to get to the other side. Don't worry, we're going to get to the other side, right? But instead of trusting what he said, and surrendering control to Jesus, they decide they need to take control of the situation. The disciples are like, we need to take control. Their response to fear was control. How many of you guys can relate to that? And so what do they do in trying to control the thing that they're afraid of? They decide they're going to wake Jesus up, right? He's not doing what we think he should do. He needs to wake up and do what actually is proper, right? Why? Because for them, and if we're being honest, for us as well, control feels safer than trust, doesn't it? Control feels a lot safer than trust. And doing something feels safer than doing nothing. Let me ask you, when you're feeling afraid, when you're feeling anxious, what is your response? How do you respond to fear? Do you try to take control? Do you try to control and try to tell God, hey, this is what you should be doing right now in my life? What is your response? And so, in waking him up, what do they say to Jesus? They say, teacher, notice this, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? There's a lot of assumptions there, right? Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? A couple of observations. First, they call him teacher. Now, I don't know about you. They've been hanging out with Jesus for a while now. They've seen Jesus do miracles. They've seen him do all sorts of signs. They've seen him teach. They've been around Jesus. And I think for me, the very last thing that I would want to call Jesus at that moment is teacher. What is a teacher going to do in a windstorm, right? Like, I'm about to die. Teach me something. Right? But they decide the name they're going to call Jesus now is teacher. In other words, their view of Jesus was far too small for the reality of their lives. They had him compartmentalized in a bucket, and they didn't know how to go beyond that when life got real. And the second observation you notice is that they don't just say teacher, they say, do you not care? Did you guys see that? Do you not care? In other words, the disciples don't just question their faith here. They question Jesus' care for them. Have you ever been in a situation where you question God's goodness for you? It's one thing to hear about his goodness for other people or just God loves the world. But do you believe that for you? That he actually cares about your life? Why? Because in their greatest moment of need, Jesus was not doing what they were expecting him to do. There was an expectation-reality gap with God. Have you ever experienced that before? Your expectation of God and the reality of your experiences with God, they don't line up. And you start to ask, not is he able, not is he God perhaps, but does he care? Does he care about me? Does he care about my life? Does he care about my family? Does he care about my child who's sick? Does he care about our family who has no money to pay the bills next month? Have you ever questioned God's care for you when life just didn't make sense? Let's continue. Verse 39. And he awoke, this is Jesus, and Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm, he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So what happened? The water splashing on his face cannot wake him up. The wind howling cannot wake him up. But his disciples screaming, "Jesus, save us," that woke Jesus up, right? Like Jesus woke up, and I just imagine, I'm sure it was not like this, but I'm just imagining like my dog sometimes. Well, it's not really my dog, it's my parents' dog. If you guys have been at Icon, you know about this Chihuahua. But this Chihuahua will wake me up in the middle of the night sometimes. And I'm not going like I'm fully awake. Like I am begrudgingly like frustrated, right? And I'm like walking up like this to the Chihuahua. And listen, in the Greek, Jesus says two words: peace, still, right? Quiet, still, those two words. That's what I imagine saying to the Chihuahua. Be quiet, still, right? Let me sleep, right? Anyways, just have fun with the Bible, all right? So, but unlike the Chihuahua who never listens, the sea actually listened to Jesus. He just said, "Quiet, still," and the sea was still. Complete peace. Can you imagine that? In an instant, what was raging, all the chaos, all the turmoil, just by two words, was gone. How many of you guys would love that in the chaos of your life? After which Jesus answers the question that the disciples asked. Do you care, he said? And he answers their question with a question. He says, "Why are you afraid?" Huh? Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? He says. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? That's the question that Jesus asked the disciples. You see, the disciples had seen Jesus do miracles. They had sat under all the seminars, all the sessions, right? They had listened to all of Jesus' teachings. And what's more, these guys knew the Bible. They knew the Old Testament. They knew there were scriptures like in Psalm 65, 89, 107, which all say that God alone, he is sovereign over the seas. He can quiet the storm, that God is in control of all nature. They had heard all of these teachings, but when life punched them in the mouth, they were knocked out. Their faith was about to tap out. But before we hate too hard on these disciples, don't we do the same? We think of theology as often theoretical, don't we? We think of this stuff that we just know in the Bible as just stories and just knowledge for ourselves, don't we? But when life actually hits you and you are faced with a storm in your life, what is your first response? Is this just knowledge up here, or is it conviction in here? Does your faith, does what you know about God actually change the way that you live for God? These disciples were in a true faith moment, and they questioned. You see, they didn't realize that the reason Jesus was sleeping in the boat was not because he didn't care. It was because he was so sovereign. It's because Jesus was so sovereign, he was so in control, that even in that moment, they were shaking, but Jesus wasn't shaken in that moment. He's not indifferent to our pain. God is not indifferent to our fears. When God is silent, it does not mean that he's apathetic. It means that he has something else he wants to say to you. But notice here in the text, when Jesus muzzles the storm, quiet, still, verse 41. It says the disciples, it doesn't say that they were no longer afraid, right? It says they were afraid with the storm, but in verse 41, it's interesting. They say now the disciples were filled with great fear. They actually got more afraid after the peace from the storm. Why? Because what they realized was that the person or the thing that they should really be afraid of was not the storm. It was the Lord over the storm. It was this Jesus in the boat with them. And so they asked themselves, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They ask, who is this guy? We thought we figured him out. We thought we knew this guy. But even the wind and the seas obey him. You see what happens when you have a true encounter with Jesus, the real Jesus, you start asking questions. You begin to realize that Jesus is so much greater than your assumptions. He's so much greater than your caricature in your mind of what Jesus is supposed to be like. Jesus is God. He is beyond our comprehension. Don't be surprised when you don't have Jesus figured out. So, that's the first part of our story. That's the first part of the story. We're going to continue now, chapter 5. And again, this is one big story. In the Greek, there's no chapters and verses, okay? So follow what Mark is trying to say here. Second part of the story, chapter 5, verse 1, follow with me. He says, then this is Jesus and the disciples. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Pause right there. It says they continue. So they made it. They were alive. They got to the other side of the sea, right? Whew, right? But notice this, the landing place. It says to the country of the Gerasenes. When you read the country of the Gerasenes in your devotional time, what do you feel? What do you think of? Yeah, like Gerasene, what is that, right? Doesn't really have any meaning, does it? But for someone who is Jewish reading the Gerasenes here, they would be absolutely appalled. They would be absolutely shocked. The Gerasenes was a part of a Gentile pagan region called the Decapolis, which represented everything the Jewish people hated. You're going to find in a bit that they had a lot of pigs for a reason. It's because the Jewish people hate pigs. We love pigs. I think, at least I do, right? But this area, the Gerasenes represented everything that any decent Jewish person hated. Even, if you guys are the Bible nerds here, the Old Testament Canaanites, they had all moved into this area. Gerasenes was a place of hate, righteous hate. They deserved hell, fire, and brimstone. This is how the Jews might have seen this area. And again, no decent, godly Jewish man or woman would go there. The disciples certainly would be like, why are we going to such a place? But Jesus decides, hey, let's just go crash at the Gerasenes. Let's go, right? Why? Why is Jesus doing this? Notice something here in the text. In the story we just came out of, we noticed a couple of observations, right? A man sleeping in a boat during a storm. Does this sound a little bit familiar to you? And if you know the Old Testament, there was one other guy, another man, in a boat, right, sleeping in a storm. His name was Jonah, right? Scholars say that this was a connection to Jonah. Some scholars say, not all scholars. Some scholars say that this was a connection to Jonah. You see, Jonah was called by God to bring God's message to the Ninevites, another pagan, hated, right, nation. But Jonah ran the other direction. He said, I'm not doing that, right? And so God brings a storm to cause Jonah to turn around. But notice here, while Jonah fled from the Gentiles, Jesus ran to the Gentiles. He went through the storms to reach the Gentiles. Same boat, same storm, but a completely different heart of obedience to God. See, that Jesus is the greater Jonah. Jesus had his heart for the Gentiles, for all people. And so, the story continues, verse 2. And when Jesus has stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. In our second story, we see Mark introduce a different person, a new person in the story, right? We see a demon-possessed man. This Mark 5 is actually the most detailed account of a demon possession in the Gospels. It sounds, if you read, a little bit like an exorcist almost, right? But Jesus deals with demons head on. Now, it's easy for us because it's scary to try to just pass it up and get to the good part. But put yourself in the demoniac's shoes. Imagine what it would be like to be him. Don't rush past it. This man was demon-possessed. The demons had driven him out of his home, away from his family, out of society, until the only place left for him was a graveyard. His neighbors were bones, skeletons. He cried out night and day in despair. He cut himself with stones because physical pain was a relief compared to his emotional turmoil. Can any of you relate to him? This man had been living under the most crushing spiritual oppression imaginable for so long that dysfunction didn't just feel like it's normal. Dysfunction felt like home. Have you ever been in a season of your life where dysfunction feels like home? It just feels like this is a part of who you are now. Maybe you can't relate to a demon possession, but you may know what it feels like to be crushed under the weight of darkness. Maybe you know what it feels like to be shackled by a sin that you just can't shake. Maybe you know what it feels like to suffer and struggle with anxiety, with addiction, or a behavior that you just can't get rid of. Something that has followed you and controlled you for so long that it's no longer just normal. Now it's your identity. And somewhere along the way, if you have been caught in this cycle, you stop believing that rescue is coming. You stop believing that hope is possible. And you surrender yourself to the darkness, waiting and hoping for death to come soon. So there's this man. And so how do the other people respond to this man? I'm sure they tried to help him, but he was beyond help. And so what did they do? They were afraid of him. He was a menace to society. It says that they tried to control this man, that thing that they were afraid of, this person that they were afraid of. We're going to lock him up. We're going to chain him up. We're going to shackle him up. But to no avail. He had superhuman strength. He would just break through all the chains. In other words, they were using man-made solutions to try to solve spiritual issues, and it just wasn't working. Why? Because only God had the solution to this kind of problem. There's no way a man-made solution can solve a spiritual problem. And again, before we judge too hard on these townspeople, don't we do the same? The problems in our life, either we try to medicate it away. There's no problem with medicine, but don't we often try to find a man-made solution first before going to God in prayer? Or if you just can't get rid of it, don't you try to cope with it with another addiction, another pleasure, alcohol, something else, a vacation, just to numb the pain that's inside, just to solve in some way this issue that I have? Are we really any different from these townspeople? But what happens? Often our man-made solutions fail. And our problems just get worse. Verse 6. And when he, this is the demoniac, saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned into the sea. So what happens in this section, we see the demoniac see Jesus from afar, and he runs to Jesus, right? I don't know about you, that would scare me, right? A demoniac man, running to me, all right. So, but the reason why he's doing that, he runs to him and he falls at his feet, but this falling at his feet is not worship, it's terror. He's afraid. And in verse 7, the demons speaking through this man's mouth asks a question. They say, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" It's interesting. Do you remember the end of the last story, or the last part of the story? The disciples see Jesus calm the storm, and what do they say? "Who is this man?" Right? They say, "Who is this man?" The irony now is that it's actually the demons who are answering the question the disciples were asking. They say, "This is Jesus, Son of the Most High God." Do you guys see that? The demons, you see, had all the right theology and answer. They knew their Bible. But it means nothing. Right? We can have all the right knowledge and theology about God, but it doesn't mean that you're a believer. Doesn't actually mean that you are his. Doesn't mean that you actually believe in Jesus. The demons even know better than we do. And yet they don't believe. And so Jesus asks for their name. And what do they say? Legion, for we are many. Right? A legion, just for context, for Roman military, was about 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers. But the point of that is not the number. The point of it is, can you imagine how much oppression this man must have experienced? Having 4,000 to 5,000 demons, let's just say, a multitude of demons every single day tormenting him. So what does Jesus do? Does he try to negotiate and do a hostage negotiation here with the demons? Right? No. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't deliberate with them. This is not a conversation I'm having with you. No, he commands the demons, "Get out." Right? And so the demons beg him to enter into a herd of pigs, 2,000 of them, it says. And then they just fall off the sea and die. That's a lot of bacon wasted. Just saying, right? I was like, that's a lot of money. Groceries are expensive these days. Okay. So the same authority which had silenced the storm had now silenced the legion. Jesus is sovereign with all authority. There's no negotiation here, right? There's no question. There's no compromise here. Let's see what happens next, though. Verse 14. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And what? They were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. So notice, Jesus calmed the sea. Just as he calmed the sea, now he calmed this man. But just like the disciples no longer fear the problem, the storm, the townspeople, they didn't fear the demoniac anymore, right? Who do they fear? Both of them. They fear Jesus. They fear this man, the one who had cost them their pigs, right? The one who had cast out the demon. Notice there's a commonality here in both parts. There's a shifting of fear from the problem to the person of Jesus. And that, my friends, is really the point. The one we should really be afraid of is not our circumstances. It should be God. The only way, in other words, the only way to overcome the fears that are ruling your life, that are controlling your life right now, is with a greater fear. The fear of the Lord. And this is not like just terror, or this is awe. This is reverence towards his holiness. This is us seeing him. This is Isaiah in front of God's throne and all the angels Seeing God's glory and his holiness for who he is and going, woe is me. Right? For I'm a sinful man. A reverence for God, fearing God. Because when your view of God is right, your view of these other problems, they feel small by comparison. This is why the Old Testament says over and over again, God says to his people over and over again, Isaiah, Joshua, do not be afraid. Why? For I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Now, he doesn't say do not be afraid because you're strong enough. He doesn't say do not be afraid because you have enough. No, he says do not be afraid, for I am with you. Because the one you should really be afraid of is on your side. But here's the thing about the fear of the Lord. You see, unlike every other fear, the fear of the Lord doesn't take life. The fear of the Lord gives life. The fear of the Lord doesn't just take life. The fear of the Lord gives life. Proverbs 14, verse 27 says, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. Do you guys see that? How beautiful is it? When we see and revere God for who he is, it's life-giving for us. Let me ask you, if you're being honest with yourself, is your fear of your circumstances greater than your fear of the Lord? What is your view of God? Do you just call him teacher? Do you just see him as this nice guy on a picture? Or just the main character on Chosen? What is your view of God? If you're being honest with yourself, do you fear God for who he really is? And so how do you expect the townspeople to respond? You would think, welcome Jesus, right? But no. They respond how? By asking him to leave. In other words, they reject Jesus. They respond to Jesus by rejecting Jesus, by asking him to leave. Why? Because they would rather deal with a fear they can manage and cope with rather than a God who they have to submit to. They would rather deal with a fear they can manage than submit to a God they can't control. It wasn't about the pigs. It wasn't about the demoniacs. It was about who's in control. But with Jesus, you can't be in control. You can't call the shots. And again, if we're being honest, don't we do the same thing? Don't you? Sometimes, have you ever asked God for things? God, I'm praying for my purpose. I'm praying for my calling. I'm praying that you would show me which direction you want me to go. And then he shows you. And you're like, God, that's too scary. God, call someone else. Right? God, I don't know how I'm going to survive. Do we submit to God? Or do we try to control God? If you're being honest with yourself. So we've seen the wrong response here, the disciples, the townspeople. But what is the right response? Verse 18. As he was getting into the boat, so Jesus being rejected is about to get on the boat and leave. The man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And this is the man, went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. So who responds to Jesus the right way? It was not the disciples, who you think would know better. It's not the townspeople, who should be like, this is our hero. No, all of them responded the wrong way. The only person who responds the right way was this demoniac, was the demon-possessed man. Why? How so? Because this man begs to be with Jesus. Do you guys see that? The man sees Jesus for who he is. He reveres Jesus for who he worships Jesus for who he is. And he says, Jesus, I'm willing to leave everything and everyone. I'm willing to leave everything else behind just to be with you. Would you take me? Do we have that kind of heart? Are we willing to leave everything and everyone just to be with Jesus like this man? And you would think, if I'm Jesus, I'm like, yes, come in, get in the boat. But what does he do? He says no, right? Jesus says no. He rejects that at least that plan, right? He doesn't reject the man, but the plan. I think that's kind of puzzling, isn't it? It's a good desire. It's a right desire. Why would you reject it? I think sometimes we have to remember that if Jesus truly is the one in charge, if he's the one in control, he gets to say no to us. It doesn't make sense sometimes, doesn't it? We can pray good prayers, biblical prayers, but because Jesus is the one in charge, sometimes he will tell us no, and it won't make sense. But again, the thing that he was saying no to was not this man. It was the man's plan to be, because he had a different plan for him. And what was the plan Jesus had for this man? He tells him to go back. Go back to who, Jesus? The people who shackled me? The people who condemned me? The people who were afraid of me? The people who know my past? The people who I'm so ashamed to be around? Those people are the ones you want me to go back to? Have you ever felt afraid of people because they knew too much about you? Have you ever felt afraid of the condemnation and the judgment and the shame? The man, I don't know about you, I'll be like, sorry, Jesus, I'm moving. I'll just take a different boat. But no, the man actually chooses to go back to the town. Why? Because he chose to submit to Jesus rather than submitting to his fear. He chose to say yes to Jesus instead of saying yes to his fear. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to do that? And what was the result of this man's obedience here? We don't see it immediately in the text. It says they marveled. We don't have time to actually go through the full story. But if you just go one chapter ahead, in the next chapter, it's beautiful in Mark 6, because you can see the results. You see, the first time Jesus came to town, the only welcoming party there was who ran to him was who? The demoniac. In Mark 6, it's beautiful. The next time he goes back to the same town, it says a whole crowd of people came to welcome him. All these people came to welcome him. How? Because this one man who was set free, who said yes to Jesus instead of saying yes to his fear, because that one man's obedience, a whole town was impacted. It's beautiful, isn't it? Listen, you don't need to be the most educated. You don't need to be the most impressive or put together. You don't need to have all the degrees and all the whatever else the world thinks is impressive. You don't need to have all of those things to serve Jesus. You just need to be willing to truly say yes to him. Are you willing to say yes? Because on the other side of your fear, whatever fear you have, whatever the greatest fear is, on the other side of your fear is Jesus. He's faithful. He's powerful. He's good. And he will be with you. So, as I close, what is the one takeaway then? We looked at one greater story with two parts. And here's the one key point for us, is this. What do you do when your fears make you want to tap out on your faith? Choose courage over control. Choose courage over control. Jesus is greater than your fears. Choose courage over control. Jesus is greater than your fears. So as we close, I would like to ask you guys to reflect. We saw three different kinds of people responding to Jesus today. The first were the disciples, who when they were confronted with their fear, tried to control, right, the situation, try to get Jesus to do what they wanted him to do. Then we saw the townspeople who, when they were seeing Jesus for who he is, they pushed him away. They wanted to stay in charge. And lastly, we saw the demoniac who was willing to risk everything, even facing his worst fears, in order to just be with Jesus. If you're being honest with yourself this morning, which kind of person reflects the condition of your heart? Which person shows you your heart towards Jesus? Are you like the disciples trying to question and control Jesus? Maybe this morning you are going, God, I don't know if you care about me today. Or maybe are you trying to push Jesus away and try to live your own path, live your own plans? Or are you like this man ready to run after Jesus and say yes to Jesus, whatever it may be? Perhaps Jesus is calling you to do something scary today. The question is, will you trust him? Will you surrender to him? The choice is yours this morning.